Hey everyone, welcome to another weapon guide for Monster Hunter World Iceborne. This time we're looking at the Switch Axe. The Switch Axe is a transforming weapon that can seamlessly morph between its axe mode and sword mode using fluid attack combos, switching between the more mobile and precise axe mode, and the highly damaging sword mode that can also build up energy for explosive attacks. I will cover the basic mechanics and attacks, before giving useful tips in the combat summary as usual, so be sure to use the chapters to navigate through this guide. As always, I play the game with a mouse and keyboard, using the default keys for base world. This table will show the equivalent keys if you're using Iceborne default keys, or a controller. Now let's get started with the basics. First we are going to look at the key differences between the two modes available for this weapon. The axe mode, and the sword mode. The axe mode is the default mode and is more mobile, allowing you to move with regular movement speed, and allows you to dodge at regular speed too. After attacks, your left and right dodges become step dodges, but your forward and backward dodges are still rolls. This also happens when you aim your slinger. Dodging again after step dodges will give you roll dodges. Axe mode attacks are generally slower, but have decently high single hit damage, along with higher precision and longer reach. The axe can also be powered up to deal more part breaking damage, making axe attacks ideal for breaking parts and flinching the monster. In sword mode, you have less mobility, walking with slow movement speed and having delays between dodges too. After attacks, your dodges for all four directions become step dodges with shorter distances than the axe mode step dodges. This happens when you aim your slinger too. Dodging again after step dodges will give you roll dodges. Sword mode attacks are mostly wide swinging combos with less precision and reach, but have faster attack combos that deal more damage, and can never be deflected. Sword attacks also benefit from a special bonus depending on its Phial type, and can also build up amped energy to make the sword deal even more damage through energy explosions. In short, axe mode for higher mobility, attack range, precision, and part breaking power. Sword mode for more overall damage and explosions, and benefits from Phials. All of the Switch Axe's attacks deal cutting damage, including the explosions. Next, let's look at how to switch between the two modes. Firstly, this is the universal morph button. Pretty much any time this button is used, you will be switching between the two modes. While not attacking, using the morph button will give you the regular morph that allows you to switch from axe to sword, or sword to axe. This is a slow manual morph that does not deliver any attacks, and forces you to stand still, so you generally want to avoid using morph like this. Instead, you should be using the morph slash, which is faster and will attack while switching modes. The morph slash is done by using the morph button after attacks, so after axe attacks, you can perform the axe to sword morph slash that hits once with the sword. And after sword attacks, you can perform the sword to axe morph slash that hits once with the axe. The axe to sword morph slash will only have a very minor forward movement if used without directional input, but you can add a forward directional input to take a bigger step forward while slashing. The sword to axe morph slash is stationary and cannot be affected by forward movement, but instead, you can add a backwards movement to change the morph slash into the downward fade slash, which is a variation that moves you backwards while switching from sword to axe, hitting once with the axe. While using the wild swings in axe mode, the morph slash will become a morph sweep instead, which is a slower but more powerful attack that moves you forward, hitting 3 times with the axe before morphing into sword mode with a sword slash. We'll be looking at the attacks in more detail in the attacks and combos section. All morph attacks can be used after one another since they also count as attacks themselves. You can also use a morph slash after a forward roll. The axe to sword version will always be the forward stepping version if used after a roll. The sword to axe version will now also have a forward stepping movement if used after a roll, this is perfect for getting out of danger while morphing back to axe mode for higher mobility. These morph slashes only work with forward rolls, and will not work with backward rolls or any step dodges. Using the morph button while your weapon is sheathed will perform a draw attack with the sword and put you directly in sword mode. This attack is the same as the axe to sword morph slash. Similarly, you can add a forward direction to the draw attack to take a bigger step forward too. Speaking of switching modes, we should discuss the switch gauge in the next chapter. As you can see, there is a gauge on the top left of your screen. This green bar inside here is known as the switch gauge. Using any sword attack will consume a portion of the switch gauge, even if you hit nothing. The gauge will not regenerate itself in sword mode, but will passively regenerate itself when you are in axe mode, or if your weapon is sheathed. Regular morphing between both modes will not consume or generate any gauge, but morph slashing from axe to sword will consume some gauge since it counts as a sword attack. This applies to the sword draw attack too. Morph slashing from sword to axe will generate a fairly large amount of the switch gauge, and this generates more switch gauge than the amount consumed by most sword attacks. This also applies to the downward fade slash. This means you always get a net gain in the gauge if you regularly morph slash into axe while using sword combos, which is great for preventing your switch gauge from getting too low. Regular axe attacks do not generate or consume any gauge, but as mentioned, the gauge passively regenerates itself when you are in axe mode. When the gauge is fully depleted, you will be forced back into axe mode with a regular morph, so this is something you want to avoid, though you can technically bypass it by quickly dodging and then sheathing, or quickly morph slashing to regain some switch gauge. When the gauge drops below this line here, it will become purple, though you can still stay in sword mode if you have not switched back yet, and can continue attacking until the gauge is depleted. But once you switch back to axe mode or sheath below this line, you will also see the icon shorten into an axe without the sword. This means you are unable to switch back into sword mode, and when you do try, you will be forced to perform a manual reload. You stay in axe mode after the reload, but the gauge is now back above the line, so you can morph back to sword mode again. The manual reload will happen whenever you try to enter sword mode below the line, even with the sword draw attack, and morph attacks into sword mode. It is a risky move since you cannot move while reloading, so it's best to avoid it unless absolutely necessary. Just stick to axe attacks until the gauge regenerates itself above the line. Next, let's talk about the amped state. Successfully landing sword attacks will generate amp charge. The amp charge generated can be seen in the amp meter, which is the green outer glow surrounding the switch gauge. The amp meter will periodically lose the generated amp charge, regardless if you are in sword mode, axe mode, or sheathed. Different sword attacks will build up different amounts of amp charge, and when the amp meter is full, your sword will be powered up, known as the amped state. This is shown by the entire gauge glowing green, and your sword will also be glowing. While in the amped state, your sword attacks will deal more damage than usual. On top of that, each sword swing will also be accompanied by an extra hit of energy burst. This energy burst still deals regular cutting damage like all your weapon attacks. The sword attack that fills the amp meter will also benefit from the energy burst. Attacking with sword combos in the amped state will make up for a big part of the switch axe's damage output. The amped state also unlocks the switch axe's signature attack, the zero-sum discharge, which allows you to latch onto the monster to deal continuous damage, finishing with a powerful explosion. We'll look at the attacks later. The amped state will last for 45 seconds by default, or 90 seconds with Power Prolonger level 3, you cannot extend the duration while it is already active. The duration stays the same regardless if you're in sword, axe, or sheathed. The amped state has zero interactions with the axe mode, it is purely built up in sword mode, and provides benefits only for sword mode. The green glow will start to flash red before the amped state expires, after which you have to build it up with sword attacks again. Next, let's talk about the Phial types. The switch axe's sword attacks are enhanced by something called phials, but this is not to be confused with the amped state because they are two totally separate mechanics. To put it simply, phials are just special bonuses that passively enhance your attacks in sword mode, but will not enhance the axe mode. These bonuses are always there as long as you are in sword mode, and do not require the sword to be in amped state, but the extra hits from amped state will certainly make these bonuses even more effective. The bonuses will be different depending on the phial type, and there are 6 different types. The type of phial will also change the sound and color of the energy explosions, as well as the color of the sword glow in amped state, which is why people tend to think that phials only affect the amped state, but this is wrong as the color is purely a visual effect only. However, different phial types will affect how quickly you can charge up your amped state. Now let's look into these phial types. The most common phial type and arguably the best one is the power phial, which can be found on any type of weapon. It simply provides a raw attack bonus when you are in sword mode, so it's useful against every monster. It has a slower build-up for the amped state, and is colored orange. The power element phial is also pretty common but is only found on weapons with an existing element, and instead of raw attack, you will get an elemental attack bonus to the existing element when you are in sword mode. It's useful if you are focusing on elemental damage. It has a faster build-up for amped state, and is colored green. Exhaust phials are less common and only found on weapons with hidden sleep element. Unless you modify your Safajiva weapons to have exhaust phials, which is generally not worth it since power and power element are better. They do not provide any attack bonus, but will add an exhaust build-up to your sword attacks. Exhaust makes monsters tired and can stun them if you hit them in the head, as if you are playing a blunt weapon. It has a faster build-up for amped state, and is colored between white and light blue. The paralysis phial is only found on a weapon with hidden paralysis status. It adds a chance to proc paralysis build up on your sword attacks. It has a slower build up for the amped state, and is colored yellow. The poison phial is only found on a weapon with hidden poison status and adds a chance to proc poison build up on your sword attacks. It has a slower build up for the amped state, and is colored purple. The dragon phial is only found on a weapon that has no element of its own, and will add dragon elemental damage to your sword attacks. It has the fastest build-up for the amped state, and is colored red. In general, power phial will be the best, but you should also consider prioritizing other stats of the weapon such as the damage and affinity, instead of just the phial type. Next up, we will look at all the attack moves and combos, starting with axe attacks. When your weapon is sheathed, you can ready your weapon in axe mode without attacking. Adding a direction will use a draw attack in the form of a side slash. This has a slight forward movement. With your weapon drawn, neutral left mouse also gives you the side slash, but this one is stationary. The side slash is a quick attack that hits once with a very low horizontal hitbox. It deals decent damage for a fast attack and is used for smaller openings, best used from the right side of the monster's head due to the attack direction. The side slash is the same attack as the sword to axe morph slash we previously discussed, except it's accessed directly from axe mode. Left mouse after side slash gives you the rising slash, which is an upward swing that hits once and can hit low, or extremely high up depending on your position. It can also be used directly as the first attack with a double mouse input. It is only slightly slower than the side slash, but still relatively fast and deals more damage and hits higher. So it can replace the side slash for many openings, and is perfect for sniping monster weak spots that are higher up, or when they are flying. Rising slash does have a slower recovery though, so when you need to combo into another attack, then side slash is still faster. Rising slash will launch your teammates into the air. Left mouse after rising slash gives you the overhead slash, which is a downward slash that hits once without moving the hunter, and the hitbox starts from behind you. This is one of the axe attacks with higher damage and good vertical reach, but it's pretty slow, especially since it must be used in a combo and cannot be used on its own. Left mouse again after overhead slash leads back to side slash, becoming a triple attack combo that loops from side slash to rising to overhead. If you use double mouse after overhead slash, it will lead back to rising slash instead, allowing you to skip the side slash and loop rising and overhead. Forward left mouse or right mouse will both give you the forward slash, which is a quick attack that hits once and moves you forward. Its specialty is the forward movement and precise forward hitbox, but generally finds itself less useful than other attacks since it has the lowest damage of all axe attacks. But when you are out of position and need a fast attack with a forward movement, this could be a good choice. Left mouse after forward slash also leads into overhead slash, which is a slightly faster way of accessing the overhead slash, especially after closing the gap using forward slash. The left mouse version can only be used as the first attack, but the right mouse version can be used anytime after most axe attacks, with some exceptions. It can also be followed up by most axe attacks, with some exceptions as well. Neutral right mouse will give you the wild swings, which are a series of horizontal swings that hits once for each swing and consumes stamina for every swing. Pressing right mouse just once will give you 2 swings, which is the minimum number of swings, but if you use left mouse quickly after the first swing, you can skip the second swing and get an overhead slash instead, which also makes the first wild swing cost no stamina. A single wild swing into overhead is the fastest way to use overhead, allowing you to take some small to medium openings. You can also get the overhead slash after 2 wild swings, useful for slightly bigger openings. If you continue with right mouse after 2 wild swings, you will add 1 additional swing for each right mouse input, and can swing endlessly until you run out of stamina. You will see a red glow right before the third swing, indicating that the wild swings will now deal more damage. Using left mouse from the third swing onwards will chain into the heavy slam instead of overhead slash. This is a slower attack but is much more powerful, hitting twice with forward momentum. The second hit is one of the strongest axe attacks in terms of damage and part-breaking power. Since it is accessed after 3 wild swings or more, it's one of the slower attacks reserved for bigger openings. You need Iceborne to use heavy slam. Using the heavy slam will also power up the axe, even if you hit nothing. This is shown by the orange glow on the gauge here, as well as on the axe head itself. This buff will make all axe attacks have higher part breaking, flinching and staggering power, but will not increase the actual damage. It only benefits axe mode and has no effect on sword mode. Sheathing or switching to sword mode will not affect the duration. It will last for 45 seconds by default, or 90 seconds with power prolonger level 3, and will start flashing faster before it expires. You can refresh the duration before it expires by using heavy slam again. You can cancel the recovery animation by performing attacks, or dodging out of it. Moving back to wild swings, the attack always starts from the right side by default, but with one exception. If you use wild swings after a rising slash, it will start from the left instead. This also allows you to use the heavy slam after 2 wild swings instead of 3, but only if you time it right. Speaking of wild swings, to recap, using morph during wild swings will give you the morph sweep. After a minimum of 1 wild swing, you can use the sweep, which is a 3-hit axe attack that moves you forward, followed by a sword attack, leaving you in sword mode. Extra wild swings will not increase the morph sweep's damage. The morph sweep deals a lot of damage overall, with the second hit of the sweep dealing very high damage. This move is slow but useful for bigger openings, and you can either continue in sword mode after that, or morph back into axe mode if you like, especially with the previously discussed downward fade slash, moving you backwards while morphing back to axe mode, hitting the monster in the process. Generally, you want to use morph sweep from the right side of the monster's head due to all the swings coming from the right side, but it is situational, so adjust accordingly. This move has a massive horizontal reach but no vertical reach at all, so don't try to use it on higher weak spots. Lastly, using backwards plus right mouse after most axe attacks will give you the fade slash. The hunter will jump backwards while attacking, hitting once and allowing you to reposition defensively or offensively. The hitbox starts low from the front and travels upwards in an arc, reaching all the way behind the hunter. The damage is decent, but it's a situational attack, and it's directionally sensitive. It can be chained into all attacks except the side slash. Next we will look at the Slinger bursts since they are tied to axe attacks only. Slinger burst is only available with Iceborne. After certain axe attacks, using the aim button will give you the Slinger burst that fires 3 Slinger ammo at once. You cannot use Slinger burst after rising slash, overhead slash, and heavy slam. You get the regular Slinger burst after most of the axe attacks, which can be used in any direction to change where you are facing, and chained into most axe attacks and morph slash 2. If used during wild swings, the Slinger burst variation will have you jumping back while shooting, but will always face forward. This version can be chained directly into morph sweep and most axe attacks, with some exceptions. Now we can look at the sword attacks. The sword attacks are a lot simpler. All left mouse attacks will swing once, and all right mouse attacks will swing twice. Left and right mouse combos can be used in combination to combine the single swings and double swings. Double swings are obviously slower and cost slightly more switch gauge to use, but it's a single cost for both swings, so it's actually less cost per swing. Double swings also generate much more amp charge than single swings. As mentioned before, each swing is followed by 1 extra hit of energy burst if the sword is in amped state, and the swing itself will also deal slightly more damage in amped state. Sword attacks are more based around combos instead of individual precise swings, so here I will focus more on the combos instead of the attack angles and movements. The first left mouse attack is an overhead slash. This attack is the same as the axe to sword morph slash, and the sword draw attack. It's a fast attack with better precision than most sword attacks. As always, it moves you slightly forward if used without direction, but will move you forward more if used with a forward direction. Left mouse after that will lead into right rising slash, and then left rising slash. These 3 will basically loop as the left mouse combo. We'll call them single slash 1, 2, and 3 to make it easier. A forward version of single slash 1 can be added between the combos, and the combo works the same if you replace the single slash 1 with the sword draw attack, or with the morph slash. Right mouse will give you the double slash. Using right mouse again leads to the heavenward flurry, which is a slower double swing, used mainly for generating amp charge. We'll call them double slash 1 and 2 to make it easier. Unlike the left mouse combo, the right mouse combo cannot be looped, you will stop after double slash 2. Instead, you can use a left mouse after double slash 2, which will lead into single slash 2, allowing you to continue attacking. Using left mouse after double slash 1 gives you single slash 1. Right mouse after any of the 3 single slashes will always lead back into double slash 1, but the version after single slash 3 will have an additional bridging slash before the double slash 1, hitting 3 times instead of 2. This is one of the better damage-dealing combos. If generating amp charge is your priority, then double/1 and 2 should be prioritized, but as mentioned before, you can freely mix up your single and double slashes. Next we will look at the element discharge and zero-sum discharge, which are still technically sword attacks. While in sword mode, using a double mouse input will give you the element discharge. This can be used on its own, or after any sword attacks. The hunter steps backwards, and then steps forward while thrusting the sword forward. This initial thrust can hit up to 3 times, will cost some switch gauge, but does not generate any amp charge. After the thrust, repeatedly clicking the left mouse will deal multiple ticks of damage that hit up to 7 times, before ending with a discharge finisher, which is a powerful explosion that hits once in an area of effect in front of you. The ticks and finisher will both generate amp charge, but only the finisher will consume some switch gauge, having the highest switch gauge consumption among all attacks. The finisher explosion deals cutting damage, and can score critical hits, but the damage is not affected by sharpness. The finisher will push you back and force you back into axe mode with a slow recovery animation that cannot be cancelled. You can get an early discharge finisher anytime by clicking backwards plus left mouse during the discharge. The early finisher deals less damage, but will otherwise behave the same way. You can also stop clicking the left mouse anytime before the finisher to cancel the element discharge without an explosion, ending with a shorter recovery animation that keeps you in sword mode. Cancel this recovery with a dodge, or right mouse, which leads into a right rising slash, allowing you to get back into sword combos. The element discharge deals good damage but is very slow and requires you to stand still, along with a slow recovery, so it's usually not ideal for punishes. If your sword is already in the amped state, and the element discharge's initial thrust connects with a monster, the hunter will automatically latch onto the monster to perform a zero-sum discharge, also known as ZSD. This move does not cost any stamina to perform despite latching onto the monster. You will latch onto the same part the thrust connects with. If the initial thrust does not connect with a monster, or connects with parts that cannot be latched onto, then you will still use the regular element discharge instead of ZSD, but the damage will be higher in amped state. While latching on, repeatedly clicking the left mouse will have the hunter stab the sword into the monster to do multiple ticks of damage, up to 12 hits, before ending with a ZSD finisher, which is also an explosion with the same properties as the discharge finisher we discussed earlier. Only the thrust and finisher consume switch gauge. The ZSD finisher will send you flying backwards and forces you back into axe mode with a lengthy recovery animation that cannot be cancelled. You can stop clicking the left mouse anytime before the finisher. This will result in an early finisher that deals less damage but will not send you flying backwards. You will just drop straight down and stay in sword mode, which can be directly followed up with a morph slash. The ZSD deals very good damage overall, especially if completed, but requires an extended opening to be used. It can be risky since most of the monster's attacks can hit you and interrupt the ZSD. The slow recovery animation is also very dangerous since you cannot cancel it. Ending the ZSD with an early finisher is a good way to avoid risky openings as well as the recovery animation. Another way to reduce the risk is to use protective mantles such as temporal or rocksteady to prevent danger and interruption, but rocksteady obviously comes with some risk. While performing the ZSD, the hunter will ignore some specific attacks that are supposed to hit hunters that clutch onto that body part. This only happens after the ZSD ticks have started, else you will still get hit. This only applies to very specific attacks, and most other attacks will still hit you. The explosion will not trigger if you get interrupted by attacks or roars, so it's better to let go manually to get the explosion if you know you will be interrupted next. Speaking of roars, while performing the ZSD, you automatically have 4 levels of earplugs, which will ignore weak roars. Strong roars will still interrupt your ZSD, but you can add one level of earplugs to make it level 5, helping you ignore strong roars too. The ZSD ticks do very little part break damage, while the finisher deals higher part break damage. Next we will involve the Clutch Claw, which is only available with Iceborne. As long as your sword is in the amped state, you can also perform the ZSD by using a double mouse after clutching onto the monster with the Clutch Claw. This is great for specifically choosing which monster part you want to attack, especially parts that are hard to reach with the manual thrust, not to mention you can switch positions after clutching on too. With the Clutch Claw method, it does not cost any switch gauge to start a ZSD, and you can still use a ZSD even if your switch gauge is purple and below the line. This is also great for extending claw staggers. Make sure your amped state does not run out after you clutch on, or you will lose the option to ZSD. If you already started ZSD, you can complete the attack even if the amped state expires before completion. While hunters usually cannot clutch onto the same spot, you can clutch onto the same spot after one hunter is already using ZSD, and you can even do ZSD together. While performing the element discharge, you can also use the Slinger aim button anytime before the finisher to fire a claw shot, which automatically clutches onto a monster in front of you. The claw shot will cost some switch gauge, and has less range than the regular Clutch Claw. The claw shot actually hits 3 times, but the first 2 hits are only at melee range, and will generate amp charge. At long range only the 3rd hit lands, which doesn't generate amp charge. If your sword is not yet in amped state but the meter is almost filled, the claw shot is a good way to chain from an element discharge into a ZSD, because you can fill the remaining amped meter using either the element discharge or claw shot itself. This is also a possible way to extend claw staggers. Obviously you can perform any Clutch Claw action after clutching on, and not necessarily the ZSD. Speaking of the Clutch Claw, the Switch Axe's Clutch Claw weapon attack will hit twice, only the second hit can break parts. Being an axe attack, it benefits from the powered axe buff. It sends the hunter flying backwards and will tenderize monster body parts in one use. It does not drop Slinger ammo unless you have the Clutch Claw boost skill. Next up, let's look at the aerial attacks. If your weapon is sheathed, left mouse in the air will give you the axe jumping slash, while the morph button gives you the sword jumping slash. If your weapon is drawn, left mouse gives you axe jumping slash if you are in axe mode, and sword jumping slash if you are in sword mode. Morph button will instead morph to the opposite mode for a jump attack. Regardless of which mode you are in, pressing double mouse in the air will give you the jumping element discharge, which will latch on for a ZSD if your sword is in amped state. Honestly, you are better off just using the Clutch Claw for ZSD. While sliding down a slope, left mouse will give you the jumping sweep using the axe. This attack has the highest axe attack damage. Morph button will give you the jumping rising slash, which brings you up into the air, which can be chained into a sword jumping slash, or jumping element discharge. All aerial attacks will build up mounting, except for element discharge. The mounting finisher is like a ZSD where you mash your left mouse button continuously, and the final explosion will cost switch gauge. It generates amp charge if your sword is not in amped state. But if it's already in amped state, then it will deal more damage instead. Much like the ZSD, you can let go of the button for an early discharge finisher. An early finisher will not deal less damage for the mounting version. Finally, let's finish up with a combat summary as usual. The switch axe is a very versatile weapon that can seamlessly morph between both modes using attack combos. Outside of speedrunning, there really isn't a right or wrong choice for most openings because of the flexibility of this weapon. The general idea of the weapon is to try to attack more with the sword due to its higher damage, and ability to build up amped state for even more damage, which also unlocks the powerful ZSD. This leads to many people neglecting the axe mode, and only switching back to axe mode for the purpose of conserving and regaining switch gauge before going back into sword again, or focusing solely on ZSD spamming. However, I would like to encourage using axe attacks for the better precision, longer reach, and part-breaking power. The higher mobility is also another advantage. There are many ways to handle the same or similar openings due to its versatility. You can choose to use the axe, sword, or morph between both depending on the current mode you are in, as well as distance and position. Sheathing your weapon can sometimes be a good idea because it provides access to sword attacks directly via the draw attack, which is faster than accessing the sword from axe mode. Sheathing also gives you even more mobility, and makes it easier to aim the clutch claw if you want to use ZSD. With all that being said, you should manage your switch gauge and try not to let it run out completely. Remember that morph slashing into axe mode will help regain a good portion of your switch gauge, and remember you can end your ZSD early instead of overcommitting and putting yourself in danger. About the armor skills. Power Prolonger is a very useful skill to increase the duration of your amped state and power axe. Evade Window and Evade Extender are great options since the switch axe relies heavily on step dodges, and cannot block or counter. Earplugs level 1 to get level 5 during ZSD if you have the slot for it. Tool Specialist would reduce the cooldown for your protective mantles if ZSD is used a lot. Focus actually helps to speed up the charging of your amped meter and switch gauge, but the effects are minor and not really worth it in my opinion. I'm simply letting you know that it affects the switch axe. When you faint, you lose the power axe but not the amped state. We have arrived at the end of this video. I hope this helped you understand the switch axe better. Thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.